Welcome back, everyone, as we dive into part two of our one through the end rankings of United States presidents. We're going to pick up right where we left off, but if you did not see part one of this two-part series, the link is in the description. It'll take you back so you can check that out. We are picking up where we left off with James Garfield, second shortest presidency that we've had. Only William Henry Harrison, who only served for a month, was shorter. Garfield's only president for about 6 months. And a good bit of that is him attempting to survive the bullet wound. He's shot at a train station in Washington, D.C. by often described as a disappointed office seeker. Charles Guiteau had severe mental health issues, had campaigned on his own for Garfield, and then started demanding really important assignments as an ambassador to some major countries, and kept showing up at the White House and kept writing letters, and eventually stalked Garfield in a train station and shot him in the back. Garfield is, to me, the great what if of all the presidents. Having only served for 6 months, being a super intelligent guy, also being somebody from Northeast Ohio, I do have a special affinity for our two Northeast Ohio presidents, both of whom were assassinated. Very sadly. Garfield's also our only ordained minister to be president. Very intelligent guy, serves as a general in the early part of the American Civil War, leads a brigade at the Battle of Shiloh, led some of my ancestors in the Battle of Middle Creek in Kentucky, but then enters a political career instead, runs for Congress, serves in Congress almost 20 years, gets elected to the Senate, but never takes his seat in the Senate because he also gets elected president. What about his presidency? So, like I said, a lot of what ifs, which I think are what hold him down from being higher. Very heavily focused on foreign policy, organizes this Pan-American conference that's going to take place with all the North and South American countries, but it never comes to fruition because Arthur killed it after Garfield died. He continues Hayes' desire for civil service reform and kind of takes it up a notch. Tries to do a lot for civil rights, appoints several prominent African Americans, including Frederick Douglass, to federal positions. I think Douglass was like a deeds recorder or something in Washington. There were a bunch of others as well, but also pushes for federal funding of universal education because he feels that the only way African Americans are ever going to really be able to overcome the kind of status as second-class citizens, especially in the South, that they're dealing with, is for them to get an education and to be able to kind of raise themselves up. But again, he dies before a lot of that is able to take place. So for me personally, because of the shortness of his term and because he was able to do very little, he's going to be probably right around the 20 to 25 range for me. I really have a hard time putting him behind Andrew Jackson and John Adams. So I'm going to put him just ahead of them. Let me see where where historians have ranked him historically. Garfield. He's going to be down further just because of the shortness of his term. 27 is where he is right now. So I guess I'm a little bit above that, but I'm pretty content to put him right here in that range. Also, I think if I've done the math right, there probably is not a 41. There's only going to be 40. So I think we can remove this row here because we're going to have, there have been 45 men who have been president, 46 presidents because you count Cleveland twice. But since we have 5, if you count Biden, whose picture isn't on here, that we're not going to be ranking, that leaves us with 40. All right, that brings us to Chester Arthur, who succeeded Garfield as president. Another one of these guys who only fills out the term of the guy he replaced, does not run for re-election or get re-election in his own right. Arthur's such an interesting guy to me because he's a product of the spoils system, at least early on, that system by which patronage jobs were given to political allies, to people who had supported you, to friends. And this is now a time when we're starting to see civil service reform, where they're going to a meritocracy system rather than a spoils system. You know, the spoils of war means you get to divide the plunder, so to speak. But Arthur had been the head of the Port of New York, which was a major job at a time when the federal government's primary revenue came through ports like New York, and New York being the biggest. So it was a big job. He was part of the Republican version of Tammany Hall in the New York machine of politics, which was, these guys were known as stalwarts. They were under a guy named Roscoe Conkling. And he actually ends up getting fired, Arthur does, during Hayes' attempt at civil service reform. But then he gets put on the ticket with Garfield, even though he's one of these stalwarts. And there, I believe the quote is that when Charles Guiteau shot Garfield, he says, "I'm a stalwart, and now Arthur is president." So he kind of spoke out in support of these stalwarts. But then Arthur surprises the very people from whom he comes by continuing to push for civil service reform. So I give a lot of credit to a guy who is a product of the spoils system for taking on the spoils system. But he also is going to be remembered for signing the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is a ban on Chinese immigration, I think for 10 years. He initially vetoes a 20-year ban, but then he gets pressured into signing another one. So there's ups and downs to Arthur's presidency. He helps with a resurgence of the Navy and kind of recognizes the Navy is going to be important for the U.S. moving forward. So there's ups and downs. Again, maybe like Tyler, somewhat limited by the fact that he was kind of filling someone else's term and maybe to a degree felt like he had to follow what Garfield wanted rather than doing his own thing and becoming his own man. And I think that probably hamstrung him a little bit. So I'm going to put him right in here, I think ahead of Martin Van Buren and John Tyler, though he may move up or down depending on where we end up. Let's see where historians put him. Chester Arthur, okay, he was 32, he's dropped as low as 35, and now he's at 30. So he's right around in the area where I've got him as well. Who are we on to now? We're on to Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland, a pretty conservative Democrat. Obviously, tariffs are a big deal. That he proposes a lower tariff to Congress, which, remember, tariffs are the income for the federal government, but he's trying to lower prices for consumers, and that hurts him in the next election. He loses to Benjamin Harrison in that next election. Some controversy with Cleveland because he ends up marrying a woman who basically could have been his daughter. It was the daughter of one of his best friends. He gets married to her, I think, while he's president. They have a daughter named Ruth, and people argued that she is the inspiration for the Baby Ruth candy bar. But while it was claimed at the time that that was the case, the Baby Ruth candy bar came out when Babe Ruth was playing baseball, and they deflected any association that they were trying to make money off his likeness by saying it was about her, but it really wasn't. What else can we say about Cleveland? Uses the veto a lot, more than most presidents. He had to deal with a Republican Congress, which made it difficult. Cleveland is one of only 2 Democrats who are president in a span of 72 years, from the election of Lincoln until the election of Franklin Roosevelt. There's a span there where only Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson are going to be Democratic presidents in a span when it was very, very difficult for Democrats to get elected in the aftermath of the Civil War. But he used the veto a lot, especially when it comes to spending. He was very conservative fiscally and would often veto bills that he thought were excessive government spending. He's also another proponent of the Navy, kind of pushing for a modern, very effective Navy to take place. Takes on the railroads. Trying to think of what else we could say about Cleveland. Where do historians put him? Because I'm thinking he's probably going to be, I'm probably going to put him right around Garfield and Andrew Jackson there in the 21-25 range. He's been as high as 17. He's around 25 today. I think that works pretty good. Let's pull up his wiki here and see if there's anything else we can find of interest, because I don't know a lot about Cleveland's presidency. He vetoed a bill the Tenure of Office Act. That's right. That's a good one. So the Tenure of Office Act was first passed when Andrew Johnson was president. It was that bill that they used to impeach him by saying he didn't have the right to fire anyone who had been approved by the Senate. And Cleveland basically said, you can't do that. You have to give me the right to be able to fire people if I need to. And eventually that act was repealed because he stood up to it. Another thing I really liked that Cleveland did was he came into office, and it was another one who really opposed the spoils system. And he actually said, you know what, if there are political appointees in the government that were appointed by my predecessor, Garfield, Arthur, that are Republicans, but they're doing a good job, they can keep their jobs. I'm not going to replace them. And I think that was a very bipartisan view to have at a time when it was difficult to do that. So I like Cleveland. I think he's a very moderate voice at a time when there weren't a lot of very moderate voices at times. So I think I'm going to put him ahead of John Adams. In fact, I'm thinking I'm going to probably move John Adams down here. We'll put him right in this area for now. Again, I'm going to probably be tweaking these as we go along a little further. All right, let's talk about Benjamin Harrison. And first, I want to show a really fascinating photo. This is from Harrison's inauguration. Now, remember, Benjamin Harrison defeats the incumbent president, Grover Cleveland, to become president of the United States. Here's Harrison taking the oath of office, and here is President Cleveland holding the umbrella over Harrison while he takes the oath of office. Just a very cool glimpse of bipartisanship there. Of course, Cleveland will will take re-election again in 4 years, becoming the only non-consecutive termed president. Harrison is traditionally ranked right around 30. I tend to lean a little higher for him than that. As I look at the people that I have in that range, I feel like he could be higher. He tries to annex Hawaii. That doesn't work out. It will end up happening in McKinley's term. Again, pushes for civil service reform. It's during Harrison's administration they're going to sign the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is named after John Sherman, who's a senator from Ohio and the brother of General Sherman, which I think was a kind of a new use of federal power to be able to take on big business. What else can we say about Benjamin Harrison? Obviously, he's responsible for the military. He's in charge when the military commits the Wounded Knee Massacre, and then he sends a bunch more troops to kind of end the Indian Wars out west. We had like 5 or 6 new states when he's president. One of the presidents who saw the most addition of states during his presidency. So I think it's a mix of good and bad. The economy kind of tanks during his administration, and I don't think he did really nearly enough to help with that. In fact, his policy on tariffs, which he thought would help the economy, I think may have hurt the economy. But I think a net positive, all told, from Benjamin Harrison. I'm going to put him maybe not as good as Hayes, but maybe right behind him and maybe ahead of Arthur, at least for now. That's where we're going to put him. So that brings us to William McKinley. Again, I'm a Northeast Ohio guy. My great uncle built the house McKinley was born in. My wife went to McKinley High School, and now she is on staff at another school that has a McKinley High School district, or high school in their district. She's not at the high school, but so he's our other Northeast Ohio guy. He's really kind of a very pro-business Republican. He's going to get in office in no small part because of the funding from some of the big, what we call the robber barons today. He's very much of the policy of what we would call imperialism, expansion, looking for opportunities to keep up with the European powers and getting involved in expanding. So it's under McKinley's administration that we're going to have the Spanish-American War. We're going to acquire Puerto Rico and the Philippines, and Hawaii is going to be annexed. Again, growing the Navy. I think by and large, McKinley, I think it's probably one of those ones that's probably being viewed less positively as time goes on, just knowing how historians view things these days. I'm looking to see where he is. Oh, he's actually pretty high. He's actually stayed pretty consistent. He was 15 20 years ago, and now he's 14. I think he'll probably go up in that area for me. I think I'd put him ahead of Monroe, but behind Polk. McKinley is assassinated very early in his second term. His running mate in the second term was... Oh, that reminds me, I have been talking about people who died in office as presidents, but I failed to mention, for example, that Benjamin Harrison lost his wife while he was in the White House. I think his wife died. She was one of the first ladies who died in the White House. So obviously that's something that may have been affecting his ability to serve effectively, and that's going to happen again with Woodrow Wilson's going to lose a wife in the White House. All right, that brings us to Theodore Roosevelt. You know my love for the man. Not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. We do have a financial panic that takes place during his full term that he was elected to. He was only elected president once. He ran twice, didn't win the second time, and brought us, you know who's coming down the road. But listen, a lot of great things that happened during Roosevelt's administration. He takes on big business. He's going to be responsible for things like the Food and Drug Administration, very much a proponent of national parks, and he's very progressive for his time, did a lot of things to help. Even though he himself was born into a very elitist family, a very wealthy New York family, he's very much for the common man and a guy of strong principles, and talked a lot about the bully pulpit. And he was one of the first modern presidents to realize the power of the office of president, not in terms of actual wielding of power, but the power of the gravitas of the position, using your status as president of the United States to get things done. He called it the bully pulpit. I've done other videos talking about Theodore Roosevelt, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but to me, going to be number one. And he's one of those rare guys that even today, I think both Republicans and Democrats, people of all political persuasions, tend to agree on. Like Washington, like Lincoln, these tend to be guys I think that are viewed positively, typically by both sides. So Theodore Roosevelt's very consistently ranked fourth, but I feel, to me, and this is a little bit of my own bias for liking the guy coming in here, to me, he's going to be number one. All right, that brings us to William Howard Taft. Taft is kind of Roosevelt's handpicked successor. He's an Ohio Republican from a very prestigious Ohio Republican family. His real goal in life, though, was to be on the Supreme Court. I don't know that he was ever really strongly desiring the office of president. He serves, I think, as Secretary of War under McKinley. I'm going to look that up because I can't remember for sure. But I'm fairly certain he was Secretary of War under McKinley. Or maybe it was Roosevelt, actually. Oh, yeah, it was Roosevelt's Secretary of War from 1904 to 1908. But he really wanted to be Chief Justice. That was his goal. He had been Governor General of the Philippines. At one time, he was preceded in that office by Arthur MacArthur Jr., who's the father of General MacArthur. But pretty solid, I think. But not great. I'm guessing he's going to be in the 20s somewhere. Let's see. Yeah, he's 23, 24 pretty consistently. And I'm pretty content to put him there as well. I'll put him right. I mean, I'm having trouble with a lot of these middle ones because I'm going to be moving them around a lot, I think. But I think I'm pretty content with him being right there. All right, here we go. You're going to be a little surprised by this one. Because here's the deal. Everyone knows my absolute disdain for Woodrow Wilson. I probably should have worn my Suck It Wilson t-shirt for this, which they're available in the merch store, by the way. But if I'm judging him strictly not on how much I hate the guy, but more on his performance in office, I just don't think he's as bad as these bottom four that I've got right here. Obviously, listen, the policies, especially when it came to race issues, awful. And I know a lot of people say, well, he was a product of his time. No, he was racist even for his time. Basically creating a situation where African Americans were either excluded from federal jobs altogether or put in very difficult situations in their federal jobs is bad. Not a fan of the income tax that gets passed during his administration. The Federal Reserve is going to take place. Now, he was a proponent of giving women the right to vote, but you know what? So was Theodore Roosevelt, who he ran against for the office of president. I think a lot of the things we give Wilson credit for would have happened with or without Woodrow Wilson as president. Not a fan of him running on a platform of keeping America out of the war. And then the minute he takes office a month later, after his second term begins, we're in the war with Spain or with Germany. So I feel like that was kind of dirty. to do that because I think he had to know that's where it was headed by that point. But you know how I feel about the guy. I think a lot more negatives than positives, and the positive things he did probably would have happened no matter who was president at that time. But I just don't think he warrants being on the same level as these guys. So I'm going to put him in here behind John Tyler. He's going to end up probably right around 35, maybe even drop down to 36. We'll see, because I'm trying to think. I don't think there's anybody else who's going to drop down there, so I think he may end up at 36. Historians are going to rank him much higher. I get that. He's typically ranked, he used to be 6. In 2000, he was 6th. Woodrow Wilson was 6th. Now he's 13th. I think that's a little more reasonable, but I hate the guy. I can't possibly rank him higher than the 30s. Okay, we are on to Warren Harding, I guess, huh? He's going to be ranked pretty low. Let's go back to our cliff notes here. The Roaring 20s. Corruption. Probably our most corrupt president. And unlike Grant's administration, Harding definitely was involved in the corruption that's taking place during his administration. I think he was a little too busy with his mistress to really effectively deal with some situations. I think during his administration, we're going to see a lot of very laissez-faire attitude toward things. He's kind of a hands-off guy, which so was Calvin Coolidge, but I think Calvin Coolidge is a hands-off guy in a positive way, whereas Warren Harding not so much. And I often joke that he's the reason Ohio hasn't had another president after having a string of 7 of them in a period of 60 years. So I think that's a pretty fair place to put Harding. Honestly, I'll put him ahead of Woodrow Wilson only because I think Harding was a bad president, but I don't think anything he did when he was president had a lasting impact. It was bad at the time. But overall, I don't think, unlike some of these other folks, they either were just criminally bad in not acting on things, or they did things that had a long-term, very negative impact. Harding was just not a good president and pretty corrupt. And he dies in office out west somewhere, I think it was. And I think the best thing that Harding did for the country was to pick Coolidge as a running mate or have Coolidge as a running mate. I don't know how much it was his choice. And Coolidge, I think, was probably our last hands-off president. In other words, a person who didn't see the office of president as something to really put forward an agenda and really kind of push. He saw himself as more of a caretaker of the country, and they called him Silent Cal. You got the Volstead Act, which of course is the act that enforces prohibition, which obviously was very negative. The Dawes Plan of 1924 is something we should probably talk about, though. So this is Charles Dawes, who was a businessman and the son of the man who led the I think it was the 7th Wisconsin, maybe the 6th Wisconsin, one of the Iron Brigade regiments at the Battle of Gettysburg. He's from Ohio, Marietta, Ohio, which is the oldest city in Ohio. It's right down on the river, just south of me. And he was the one who put forward what was called the Dawes Plan, which was an attempt by the United States. Actually, I shouldn't say an attempt. It was successful by the United States to help Germany with the reparations. Germany, just debilitated financially and economically in the aftermath of World War I because of the severe penalties that were placed on it by the Treaty of Versailles. And the United States, who did not support that heavy punishment, but rather tried to push for leniency, which in hindsight would have been a good idea because we know how that pushed Germany into the arms of the National Socialists. So the United States is trying to help Germany financially, and so there's these major loans that are set up to help Germany to be able to pay off the debt that they owe from that. But of course, we know that throughout the 1920s, things are going to go downhill and go downhill fast. And then in the early part of Herbert Hoover's administration, we're going to get the stock market crash and then the descent into depression. But Calvin Coolidge is going to be typically ranked right around 25, 27. I think that's probably pretty fair because Coolidge is a guy that honestly he didn't do anything bad. There's no real strong negatives, I don't think, other than obviously Prohibition, which a lot of people were responsible for. But I feel like Coolidge also didn't proactively do a lot of things. So that's probably why he ends up in the middle somewhere. But I'm going to, at least for now, put him behind Grant. He may drop a little more, but we'll see how the rest of this fills out. We may have to be bumping some people up depending on where the others come in. Herbert Hoover obviously gets a huge bad rap because of the Depression. I think the Depression probably is inevitable by the time Hoover takes office. But listen, who do you want in charge of the country when a Depression happens? Who better than a Secretary of Commerce? Super intelligent guy who Hoover was. He was Secretary of Commerce at one time, but no. I think if anything, some of his policies probably make the situation worse. Let's look at our cliff notes here about Herbert Hoover. Hawley Smoot tariff, Black Tuesday. Listen, Hoover, there's no getting around it. He did not handle the Depression well. It would have happened regardless. He didn't handle it well. He's typically ranked mid-30s. I think that's probably pretty fair for him. I'll put him behind Tyler, but ahead of Harding, which means we're going to drop Wilson down here. I'm looking ahead here. I don't see anybody who's going to probably drop into the 31 through 40 range, so that's probably going to be our 31 through 40 wrapped up, but we'll see. All right, let's talk about Franklin Roosevelt. Historians are going to rank him right near the top. He was second in 2000, historically about third. I'm not quite so eager to put him that high. For now, I'm going to put him up here ahead of Jefferson in 6. He may end up back in the top 5 by the time we're said and done. What can we say positively about him? Leadership in World War II, fantastic. I think he did a great job. I think there's a lot to be admired in overcoming his disability, which was not something he was born with, but happened to him in adulthood. But I'm conservative, so some of his economic policies I'm not a huge fan of. I think they probably had less to do with pulling the U.S. out of the Depression than some people give him credit for. And obviously the 4-term thing, listen, I get it. It was a unique situation. By 1940, when he's running for a 3rd term, the world is already at war, and everybody sees that we're headed that direction. But I think there's certainly a degree of vanity there with all of that, too. Japanese internment camps, can't overlook that. A president actively rounding up American citizens and putting them in camps to keep an eye on them because they might, be a threat. I get it. In wartime, people get scared, people get paranoid, people get worried, but we shouldn't use that as an excuse to deny people of their basic rights. So that's tough to overlook. But I think a net positive, like I said, great leadership at a time when we desperately needed it in World War II. Did everything he could to help the Allies before the U.S. gets into the war. I think largely makes the right moves when it comes to the war. Lets his generals run the show, but is very involved. And some of the economic policies and the social safety net stuff were good things, and these were things that other countries were doing as well. It's pretty much par for the course for a great power to do. So I'll put him 6th. He may end up in the top 5. We don't have that many presidents left. Harry Truman. So he is our last person that has been elected president who has been in the Army and seen combat in the Army. We've had a couple of presidents since then who have been in combat. JFK, George H.W. Bush, they were both in the Navy. Others were in the military but didn't necessarily see combat. Ike obviously led troops in World War II but never was on the ground in combat. Harry Truman is a artillery captain during the First World War. Very kind of, I think, quiet guy as a senator. But imagine getting thrust into the vice presidency and then a month later the presidency in the middle of World War II, and immediately you're having to make decisions about things like the atomic bomb, which I will defend him on to the day I die. With the information he had, with the situation as it was, it would have been criminal for Harry Truman to make any other decision except dropping those bombs. Absolutely will defend that. I'm not going to go back with 80 years of hindsight and say, oh, Truman should never have done that. In that situation, with that information, with the circumstances he was facing, he absolutely made the right call, and I would have done exactly the same thing. I think Truman's a solid president. Where do they put him historically? He's fifth, sixth. I don't know if I'd put him that high, but I'll put him right here around Thomas Jefferson. I think that's a pretty good spot for him. And listen, as I said during episode 1, I am not going into a ton of detail about all these presidents, especially the ones we know pretty well. This is not meant to be an exhaustive examination of their presidencies. A lot of this, I'm just going on my own information that I've gleaned over the years, and I'm mentioning a few things here and there that people tend to talk about. But if you want to know more about these presidents, I encourage you to study up on your own and learn a lot more about them. Because obviously, Harry Truman's presidency is much more than World War II, and obviously he leads us during Korea, and there's a lot of domestic policy stuff going on as well. He is responsible for integrating the Army, which is, I think, a huge positive, that he gives the executive order causing the desegregation of the military. So there's a lot more to Truman and a lot of these other folks that I'm just not really going into. Dwight Eisenhower. So another one of those presidents with no prior political experience before becoming president. He's a career military guy and a career kind of staff officer. He's not somebody who's ever led troops in combat on the ground. He's always been kind of at headquarters. He's stateside during the First World War, but he is very politically minded in how he leads the coalition of allies in Europe during the Second World War, and I think does that very effectively. And I think is a very solid president as well. Probably one of our last truly moderate voices that have been president. Now we're getting more and more polarized as time goes on. We've had a few others that have been moderate. Gerald Ford comes to mind, for example. But again, he's president at a critical time in American history. Obviously, we've got the rise of communism, and he's going to be strong when it comes to containment of communism. He's going to put some of the initial policies in place that are going to lead to Vietnam, which is not necessarily positive. But he also is responsible for the early stages of the space race with the establishing of NASA. We established the interstate highway system during his administration. I think probably a top 10 president. Let's see where he's ranked historically. Yeah, he was ninth. He's now been getting ranked 5th. I'm pretty happy with that ranking. I would put him just behind Roosevelt in that area here. In fact, I think we're probably going to end up moving Roosevelt up, so I'll just bump him up there now. We'll see how this all shakes out when we're done. So who are we on to now? We are on to John F. Kennedy. Now, Kennedy, I think, is a good president. Solid leadership during a incredibly tense time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but also we had the Bay of Pigs, which was a disaster. But I think a solid president. He presides. He's a Democrat a wealthy Democrat, but who presides over a huge cut in the top tax rate, which I think was a positive thing. I think sometimes we tend to idolize him a little more than we should because he died in office and was young when he died. Our youngest elected president, only Theodore Roosevelt was younger, but he took office when the president died. And so I think he gets mythologized a little bit because of that. And there's that what if factor to it. I don't think he's as high as a lot of people would put him. I'd tend to put him in that 11 to 15 range. He's going to be ranked where? 8, around 8. I don't know if I'd put him that high. I feel like I'm pretty content with putting him around 12th, but we'll see where he ends up. Okay, Lyndon Johnson, a Southern Democrat who ends up signing some of the most important civil rights legislation in history, but also presides over our entry into the Vietnam War in a significant way. which I don't think was a positive. He's also the Great Society, so he's going to be like kind of doubling down and expanding on some of FDR's social reforms, things like that. So I think probably a net positive to the country, but I wouldn't rank him all that highly. I feel like Johnson's going to be kind of in this 16 to 20 range for me. I'm guessing historians probably have him higher. Yeah, they've got him around 10. Yeah, I don't think I'd go that high with him. I feel like the stuff he is responsible for drops him down a little bit more than that. I'll put him right behind Madison for now. Richard Nixon. I think Nixon's another one that's going to be probably viewed more positively as time goes on, but listen, it's hard to get around the fact that the guy did things that required him to resign before he could be impeached and removed from office. But foreign policy, I think, was pretty solid. Environmental Protection Agency, which whatever you feel about the EPA and policies in modern times, I think at the time it was probably a much needed and important thing. Listen, I live in Northeast Ohio. Our freaking river caught on fire in Cleveland because of pollution. And of course, now we're dealing with the issue with the derailment, which happened about 15 miles from my house. So I'm guessing Nixon's going to be ranked like down like in the 30s. Yeah, he used to actually be higher, 26, 31. So basically what's happening is all the presidents that have come after him have been ranked higher, which is what has pushed him down. For me, I think I'll put him ahead of John Adams for sure. Yeah, I think about 26 may be a pretty good spot for Nixon. Gerald Ford, only person to never be elected president or vice president. He actually, they had passed a constitutional amendment which created the procedure for replacing a vice president when that office is vacated, and then immediately needed to use it because Spiro Agnew, Nixon's vice president, resigned. And so he appoints Gerald Ford, who's the House Minority Leader and a very moderate Republican at a time when the parties are starting to become more polarized. And of course, Ford comes in, he pardons Nixon, thinking it would help the country move on. It wasn't because he was a crony and it was corruption, although it was spun that way and it was viewed that way by a lot of people. He genuinely, I think Gerald Ford was genuinely a very good and decent person. Who did what he thought was right, even if it necessarily wasn't the best thing. Let's look at the cliff notes on him. There's really not a lot there, the Helsinki Accords. I think Ford's a pretty solid president, but again, pretty short term in office, or else he might have been able to do more. I think low 20s, upper 30s is probably a good spot for him. I'll drop him in there for now, right behind Grover Cleveland. You know what? I think Nixon should be higher than Ford, though. So I'll put Ford right there. All right, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter's another one of those guys who his presidency is probably the least highly regarded part of his life. You know, John Adams, same way. Jimmy Carter's just a great guy. The world is, I say this all the time, a much better place with Jimmy Carter in it. His presidency was not great, though. There were some bright spots. Right, you know, his involvement with trying to bring peace in the Middle East, I think, is positive. I think his foreign policy worked pretty well for the most part. I think domestic policy did not help a lot of the economic issues that were happening during his presidency. So to me, he's going to end up being, man, we've got this pretty full down here already, but we're probably going to have to move some folks around, because I feel like Carter's going to probably have to go in here maybe in the 26 to 30 range. Where do historians put him? 26. All right. That's about where I'd put him too. So I think we're going to have to move Madison up. We're going to move Garfield up. And then we're going to put him there. And I think we'll put Jimmy Carter right there at 26th. Now, you know what? I think John Adams and Zachary Taylor, I honestly, I'm going to put him 30th, or 29th. No, that's 30th. I'll put him 30th. I think that's a pretty good spot for him. All right, that brings us to the last three, and these are the ones that I'm going to get the most grief over from folks, so I'm not going to talk too much into them. Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton. Ronald Reagan, I'm a conservative. I view his presidency pretty positively. Obviously, folks are going to talk about trickle-down economics being very hurtful to the country. His foreign policy, I think, was fantastic. I think he kind of hit all the right notes on foreign policy at a crucial time in history where things are changing rapidly with the Iron Curtain and the Eastern Bloc nations of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. So I think all of that was done very positively. I'm going to put Reagan at 10 for me. He may not be that high by historians. He's ninth. Okay, so he's right there. And we'll see how this all shakes out. He may end up being ninth before it's all said and done. But again, I'm not going to go in too deep on any of these guys just because it's less for us to argue about later on. George H.W. Bush is one of those ones. He's a one-term president who I think, as time goes on, we'll see more favorably. Where do historians rank him? 20, still right around 20. He's been as high as 18. I think that's probably pretty fair. Yeah, we'll move Lyndon Johnson up. I think we'll put George H.W. Bush right after Garfield. I think that's a pretty good spot for him. And Bill Clinton's going to probably go right in that same general area. Pretty moderate guy at a time when things were starting to get really polarized in the country. Pushes for balanced budget. I think does a pretty good job of kind of negotiating with both sides on some things. Pretty young guy, one of our younger presidents to be elected. I think he's probably ranked in that same area as George H.W. Bush. Where is Clinton? Yeah, he's actually right there. He's around 20th, 19th, that area. I'm pretty content with that as well. In fact, I'll put him just ahead of Bush. So that means we're going to move a couple folks up here. Interesting where some of these ended up. I didn't think it would go this way. I'm going to read through all of these just to make sure that I'm pretty content with the rankings, but this is kind of how it shakes out, right? So our top 5 are going to be Theodore Roosevelt, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, and Dwight Eisenhower for our top 5. How does that compare to historians' top 5s? Same 5 guys, just slightly different order, at least according to the modern ranking of those 5 presidents. Then we've got 6th is Thomas Jefferson. We have Harry Truman, James Polk, Ronald Reagan, JFK. Pretty much the same, though we're seeing Obama put in the top 10. I'm not willing to rank Obama right now, and I don't think I'd have him that high if I did. Then we're going to go to William McKinley, James Monroe, James Madison, Lyndon Johnson, and John Quincy Adams for 11 through 15. And then Grant is 16, Calvin Coolidge, James Garfield, Bill Clinton, and George H.W. Bush are our 16 through 20. Then we have Andrew Jackson, William Howard Taft, Grover Cleveland. Stephen Grover Cleveland is his name. Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford as our 21 through 25. 26, John Adams. Then we have Zachary Taylor, Rutherford B. Hayes, Benjamin Harrison, and Jimmy Carter. 31 through 35 are going to be Chester Arthur, Martin Van Buren, John Tyler, Herbert Hoover, and Warren Harding. Then 36 through 40, we have Woodrow Wilson, Alec Baldwin, a.k.a. Millard Fillmore. Yes, I will always make that joke. Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, and Andrew Johnson. Let me know what I got right. Let me know what I got wrong. Use the comment section below. If you have requests for other videos you'd like to see, let me know that as well. And please hit that like button if you would. We'll be back again soon. Thanks for watching.